Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents No Way Out by T.L. Payne, narrated by Shawn Compton. Chapter 1. Will. Day of Event. It's just a house, Will told himself as he nailed the last piece of plywood over the window. It was just wood, bricks, and concrete. That's what he told himself, but Will Fontenot knew better. It had been a home, a real home, the place where he'd been happy once, where his wife and son had been happy. Will studied his house. He'd done all he could. He hoped the sandbags and boards over the windows would be enough. The door slammed, and Will saw his son Caden round the corner carrying his suitcase. It wasn't just a house to Caden, either. It was written all over his face as he stared back at their boarded-up home. Will wanted to reach out, to comfort his son somehow, if only Caden would let him. "Do you think the water will reach my bedroom?" Caden asked. They were the first words Caden had spoken to him all week. Will kept track, for the therapist. Caden's, not his. She would ask Will about it at Caden's next visit. His son suddenly seemed so small, much like the little boy that he'd been that night 2 years before. Will looked away, unable to face him. "Maybe," Will said. He couldn't lie to him. He wished he could. He would love to tell his son what he wanted to hear, that their house would be spared the damage from the incoming hurricane, but he couldn't. At 13 years old, Caden was way too smart for that. He knew what a Category 5 storm could do. "Will you grab my backpack?" Will asked. "It's just inside the door." Caden grunted and dropped his suitcase near the back of the 1978 Jeep Wagoneer. Will had opted to take the old SUV rather than his truck. The truck was insured. He could get another. But the Jeep was irreplaceable. It had been his grandfather's and would be Caden's in another 3 years. Will placed the hammer and nails back in the garage and pressed the down button on the remote. He knew the next time he saw his truck or his tools, they would be underwater. The house had been spared during the last few hurricanes that had hit the Texas coast, but this time the monster storm was heading straight for them. Even though Caden wouldn't articulate it, Will knew what was on his mind. Will felt it too. If the house still stood after the storm passed, instead of opening his closet and smelling the scent of his wife's perfume, he'd smell the stench of stagnant floodwater. Where they'd sat and enjoyed breakfast on Sundays, there'd be a foot of mud and debris. His hands balled into fists. Will cursed the storm that threatened to erase the last bit of his wife from their lives. He turned to face the Jeep and sucked in a breath. It wasn't the storm that was to blame for that. He was. It was all him. He was the reason Caden no longer had a mother. Will bowed his head and placed a hand on the side of the SUV. "Here," Caden said, walking up behind him. Caden dropped the backpack into the back of the Jeep and walked around to the passenger side. "I locked the door, too," he said. Will nodded and stole one last look before climbing in and putting the Jeep into gear. On the freeway heading north, Will let the Jeep roll forward a few more feet, coming to a stop behind the loaded-down pickup truck he'd been behind for the last several hours. It seemed all 2 million residents of Houston, Texas, were attempting to evacuate at that moment. He ran a hand across his close-cropped brown hair and wiped the sweat from his brow. Caden hadn't said a word since he'd plopped into the front seat and stuffed earbuds into his ears. There'd be no conversation on this trip. They had a lot of one-way conversations. Will kept trying, hoping eventually for the forgiveness that he feared would never come. In the 6 hours they'd been on the road, traffic along East Tex Freeway had moved less than 10 miles, many times coming to a standstill for several minutes before inching forward only to stop again. Will was about to lose his mind. They were still 80 miles from Point Blank and his family's house on Lake Livingston. Will's phone rang, and Caden retrieved it from the cup holder between the seats. "It's Aunt Savannah," he said. handing the phone to Will. "Put her on speaker," Will said. Caden connected the call and placed the phone down between them. "Hey, sis," Will said. "Hey, yourself. Are you two on the road?" Savannah asked. "For about 6 hours already." 6 hours? How far have you made it? "About 10 or 15 miles, Will said. "That sucks. I told you should have left earlier." Will said nothing. They both knew she was right. The last thing Will needed was a lecture from his younger sister. Yes, he should have left yesterday. He would have avoided most of the evacuation traffic, but he'd been trying to arrange to pick up Caden's birthday present early. He'd hoped that getting the puppy would make staying up at the lake house more tolerable for Caden. "How's Caden?" "Ask him yourself, you're on speaker." "Hi, Aunt Savannah," Caden said. "How's it going, bud?" Savannah asked. "Okay," Caden replied. Will knew the one-word response was only because he was listening. Caden didn't have a problem talking to Savannah. "Well, I called to wish you a happy birthday. I wish I could be there," Savannah said. "Thanks," Caden said. "I know. Maybe we can come to see you soon." "Yeah, the kids would love it. Tell that brother of mine he should just come here instead. You know you both are welcome." Caden glanced over. "He heard you." "Well, I'll be here if you change your mind." "Thanks, Savannah," Will said. "Love you guys," she said. "Love you too," Will said. Caden placed his earbuds back into his ears, and Will turned his attention back to watching the truck's brake lights in front of him. He glanced at the fuel gauge and then toward the back of the vehicle. At this rate, they would run out of fuel before they even reached the city limits of Humble. There'd be no way they'd make it all the way to Point Blank before having to refuel. After hours stuck in traffic near downtown Houston, they were forced to leave the highway searching for gasoline. Will pulled off at the next exit, only to be greeted by a long line of vehicles waiting their turn at the gas pumps. After finally filling up, Will pulled away from the fueling island. Will saw the vehicle careening toward them a second before the impact. A waterfall of glass cascaded down around him. The metallic groan was deafening. Past and present collided in his mind. Stunned, Will searched for the door handle. He heard screaming. "Melanie?" Coppery blood pooled in his mouth. "There's smoke." He had to get out. He had to get his wife out. No, no, no. "Melanie!" Will yelled. "Dad!" "Caden!" No, this is wrong. This is all wrong. Shaking off his stunned confusion, Will looked around. A mid-sized sedan had jumped the curb and gone airborne, barreling sideways through the parking lot and narrowly missing an older gentleman standing outside his truck. The vehicle had rammed into the line of cars waiting at the fueling island, then continued past them and slammed into the side of the Jeep. This was not one of his nightmares. This was real. And this time it was his son's life at stake. Will strained against the seatbelt and reached for Caden. "We have to get out of here." His gaze shot to the cars, shoved together in a jumbled mess of metal just outside his door. There was smoke. The fuel pumps. He had to get Caden away from there before the gas pumps exploded. Reaching down, Will quickly turned the key, shifted the old Jeep into gear, and punched the gas. The Jeep's heavy-duty grill guard clipped the bumper of the car blocking his path, pushing it aside. Will's heart raced as they sped across the parking lot. Blood filled his eyes from a gash above his brow. He couldn't see. "Dad, stop!" Will stomped on the brakes. He and Caden were flung forward by the inertia. The seatbelt dug into his shoulder. The vehicle stopped inches from the concrete wall that separated the parking lot from the building next door. Will wiped the blood from his eyes and turned to his son. "Are you hurt?" Will asked as he ran his hands over his son's torso and arms. "I'm fine. Dad, I'm fine," Caden said sharply. "What happened?" "That car jumped the curb," Will said, turning his attention to the chaos outside the Jeep. Caden unbuckled his seatbelt and stared out the shattered window. "Is anyone hurt?" he asked. Will glanced at the wreckage. Maybe. Shouldn't we help? Caden said, reaching for the door handle. Wait here, Will said, opening his door. He examined the dent in the side of the old Jeep Wagoneer, surprised that there wasn't more damage. Images of his wife's mangled Volvo flashed before him. He quickly pushed the memory aside. Lock the doors, Will said, shoving the keys into his pocket. I don't think it will do much good, Caden said, pointing to the broken window. Stay in the car, Will said. As he ran around the side of the building, Will could see that the careening car had shoved an SUV over top of the pump. Will weaved between cars and stopped in the parking lot. The vehicle burst into flames. In seconds, smoke rose from its back window. Mothers and fathers snatched small children from their cars and ran from the burning wreckage. That woman's trapped, a man yelled as he ran from the scene. Without thinking, Will ran toward the burning SUV. Someone turn off the pumps, a woman yelled. Another shouted for someone to call 911. As Will ran, he reached into his pocket and retrieved his cell phone. The screen was black. He pressed the button over and over, but his phone was dead. My phone's dead, a 20-something man said. So is mine, another replied. As Will approached the burning SUV, the heat coming from the gas pump was intense. The back half of the car that sat on top of the pump was now fully engulfed in flames. Will expected it to explode at any moment. His stomach tightened. He had to act fast, but time seemed to slow. Voices stilled as Will focused on the driver slumped over the wheel. He raced to the driver's door. The interior of the car was full of smoke. Yellow flames flickered between the twisted metal. Will sucked in the rancid, smoke-filled air and coughed. His eyes stung and tears streamed down his cheeks. Will shielded his mouth and nose with his shirt and pulled on the door's handle. It was locked. Will pounded on the glass, trying to rouse the woman. The back seat was now in flames. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and watch this woman burn to death. Panic gripped him. His heart raced. He felt his mind slipping, detaching. Not now. Not here. Images flashed through his mind. The sights, sounds, and smells of the night that had changed his family forever nearly paralyzed him. He was back there watching his wife as she lay trapped in the mangled, twisted metal of her Volvo. Her screams pierced his soul as the heat from the flames melted the fabric of her synthetic clothing. Will fought to shake off the overwhelming guilt and shame that hit him like a tidal wave. Screams jerked him from the fog. It's going to explode, a woman screamed. Will reached into his pocket and found his car keys. On the ring was his car escape tool. He pressed the device against the window in one fluid motion, punching a hole in the glass. A rush of heat and smoke hit him in the face. He coughed violently as he reached in and yanked open the car door. The flames, now fueled by outside air, intensified and spread to the front passenger seat. Will grabbed the woman by the arm and yanked hard. She screamed but didn't budge. Will reached down and felt for the seatbelt across her waist. For a moment it was Melanie's frightened eyes that stared back at him, pleading with him to save her. Will pulled and tugged, but the belt didn't budge. He turned the tool around and used it to slice through the strap. I'm getting you out, he said as he pulled her from her seat. Will dragged her away from the burning vehicle. Not taking time to stop and assess the woman's injuries, he scooped her up into his arms and ran toward his Jeep. He hoped the building would shield him from any fiery debris that might be propelled into the air by an explosion. No sooner had he placed her on the grass by the road than the car, then the pumps, exploded, sending a ball of flames into the air. Will kneeled next to the woman, gasping and coughing as he tried to suck in oxygen. He felt a hand on his back. Is she okay? Will glanced back. A petite Asian woman, clutching a green duffel bag to her chest, bent over the injured woman. She's in shock. She needs a hospital, the woman said, straightening. She looked like she needed medical attention herself. Blood dripped from a gash above her eye. Her lip was split and her pants were torn. An ambulance should be here any minute, Will said. You're injured. You should sit down. Even without calling 911, surely the fire department or police would see the massive ball of flames shooting into the air. People were standing in the middle of the parking lot staring at the burning wreckage. Get back behind the building. There could be more explosions, Will said, pointing to the side of the store. Will turned his attention back to the injured woman on the ground. She stared at him, wild-eyed. Will could see blood in her long brown hair. He wiped it from her face and examined the bump above her brow. She had abrasions on her left cheek. Her right forearm was burned. It looked like her wrist might be broken as well. She needed medical attention right away. Caden appeared by his side. Is she all right? Run to the Jeep and get the trauma kit from the back, Will said, tossing him the keys. Get the one in the red and yellow duffel. Grab a bottle of water, too. Will hoped that emergency services would arrive before he'd need the trauma kit. After his and his wife's accident, he'd vowed to never be caught without one again. He'd taken a first aid class and made sure to carry the bag in his vehicle at all times, but he'd never had to use it. Will looked up, searching for fire trucks, ambulance, or police. He saw none. What he saw were vehicles piled up in the intersection. Smoke was coming from one of the buildings downtown. What in the world is going on here? Something wasn't right. The lights had cut out, the phones all stopped working, and cars just died all at once. This was no storm. This was something else entirely. Do you know what happened? Will asked the Asian woman, still standing over them. My car died. I had no brakes. The car would not steer. It was an accident, she said in a thick accent. I understand, was all Will could say. It wasn't his place to absolve her of her guilt. He certainly couldn't exculpate himself from his own. That day, 2 years ago, he'd been the one to run the red light. It was his carelessness that had left his son without a mother, and there was no taking that back. There were no words that could undo what he'd done. No, there was nothing he could say to ease this woman's guilt. Where are the ambulance and fire department? Where's the police? Will asked no one in particular. There are wrecks everywhere. They're going to be very busy, a middle-aged man standing nearby said. What happened? The woman from the burning car asked. You've been in an accident, Will said. She raised her burned arm and looked at it. She squeezed her eyes shut. What's your name? Will asked. Isabella D'Angelo. My emergency contact is Kevin Arnold. He's my boyfriend, she said. Well, Isabella, I think you're going to need a stitch or two in that gash above your eye. The woman tried to sit up. The petite woman's shoulder-length brown hair was matted to the side of her face. Blood had dripped onto her pink top and her blue jeans. I need to get up. I have to get home, Isabella said. Is she okay, Dad? Caden asked as he dropped the trauma kit on the ground next to the woman. She'll be fine. She has a little gash above her eye. They tend to bleed a lot. Why don't you go start the car and get the air conditioner going? We might have to drive her to the hospital, Will said. None of the cars will start, the woman parked next to them said as she exited her vehicle. None of them? Will asked. Something's wrong. No hurricane knocks out phones and makes cars not run, a man in his 50s said as he approached Will. None of the cars will start? Will asked as he hurried toward his Jeep. Just before he reached the door, Caden turned the key and the engine roared to life. Will turned back to the people gathered around the injured woman. Mine started fine. Maybe you're just out of gas. Why is your car working when no one else's runs? One of the men asked. I have no idea. Will looked around. All the other vehicles were newer model cars, SUVs, and trucks. His grandfather's Jeep was over 40 years old. That was the only explanation he could come up with at the moment. "I just filled up. I should have 15 gallons of gas in there. It just won't start for some reason," a stocky man said. "Mine too," another man said. "It's the aliens. I told you, Betty. Didn't I tell you they were planning something big?" said a balding, paunchy man wearing a black cowboy hat and scuffed boots. It wasn't long ago that Will would have dismissed that idea as crazy talk. But after the Pentagon announced that it was establishing a task force on the subject, Will had actually stopped to consider it for a moment. It wasn't that he believed that little green men from Mars could be behind whatever was happening at the moment. It was more his concern about unidentified flying objects of more earthly origins. The Russians, Chinese, and even North Korea all had technologies that the general public wasn't aware of. Will was sure of it. If this was something of man-made origins, it would be from one of them. "Don't start with that crap again, Herman. This ain't the time for your alien conspiracy theories. This is real. That hurricane churning out there in the Gulf ain't gonna wait for the mechanic to fix our truck. We gotta get the hell out of here now," the short, pudgy woman standing next to him said. The people huddling near the intersection, watching the cars near the pumps burn, seemed as clueless as Will was. The electricity could be explained. If the hurricane had spawned tornadoes or dumped early rain on a substation area, that could cause an outage. The loss of cell service during a storm could be as well, but there was barely a cloud in the sky, and that wouldn't cause phones to not power up at all. Cars suddenly dying and not restarting? Will didn't know how to explain that. Chapter 2. Betley, Day of Event. As FBI agent James Betley turned his dark blue sedan onto Interstate 610, he pressed the phone icon button on his steering wheel and said, "Hello?" "I have to go today," a female voice said. "No, that's not possible. Just hold on a few more days and I'll pull you out," Betley said. "I can't. They know. I have to go today." Betley exhaled hard. Dealing with informants was never easy. He'd spent months developing this contact, and he wasn't about to let her slip off the hook now. Not when they were so close to blowing open the biggest corporate espionage case of his career. His partner, Agent Nico Rodriguez, pointed to the dash and mouthed, "Mute it." Betley pressed the mute button on the instrument panel. "We have to bring her in and calm her down. If she's compromised, it could bring down the whole investigation. Ryback has been itching to give this case to the task force investigating the breach at the Texas power grid ever since the CIA alerted us to what the Chinese Communist Party's been doing at their consulate in Houston." There had been a lot of activity with the CCP lately. It wasn't anything unusual to have multiple investigations swirling around the consulate, but Betley didn't see any connection between his corporate espionage case and the investigation into the Communist Party's unusual interest in the nation's energy sector. Betley hadn't been read in on the case, other than being told to pump his sources for any information about anyone snooping around power plants or oil refineries. What information the 7th floor had received from the Central Intelligence Agency, Betley didn't know. He'd give his left nut to get on that task force. With the contacts he was making in the Chinese community, he'd be a valuable asset to the team, not to mention how it would help his career. "Okay, I'll insist," Betley said, depressing the button to unmute the call. "You still there?" Betley asked. "Yes. Are you going to get me papers?" the informant asked. "Meet me," Betley said. "It is too risky. I think they are having me followed." "Where are you? I'll come to you," Betley said. "No, you're not listening. I have what you want. I need you to keep your promise and get me papers, or I am out of here." "I'm on the 610. I can meet you at the usual place in about 20 minutes, Betley said. "What if I'm being followed?" "Call me when you get close. Stay on the line and drive around the block twice. I will be able to tell if you have a tail," Betley said, glancing over to Rodriguez and shaking his head in frustration. "All right.
I'll turn around and... She paused. Oh no, they are following. What do I do?
Act normal. Don't let them know you suspect they're back there, Bentley said. He heard the screech of tires on pavement. Slow down. You don't know for sure that they're following you, Bentley said. The line went dead. Bentley's gaze dropped to the dash's instrument panel. It was blank. The sedan had died. Bentley mashed the brake. What the hell? Rodriguez said. As Bentley attempted to steer the vehicle onto the shoulder, another car rammed into him from behind. Luckily, they weren't going very fast, and Bentley was able to coast to a stop well off the roadway. Bentley put the sedan into park and pushed open the car door. As he climbed out of the vehicle, he saw other cars veering to avoid a collision and steering to the shoulder of the road. He turned and stared down the eastbound lanes. Cars were stopped in the roadway as far as the eye could see. Immediately, the silence struck him. It was an unearthly experience in the middle of a city that over 4 million people called home. Rodriguez exited the sedan and came around to join Bentley on the roadway. Others had left their vehicles and were milling about along the shoulder. Bentley walked back to the car that had struck him. He leaned down and peered into the driver's window. The driver sat rigid in her seat, staring straight ahead. He tapped on the glass. When she turned to look at him, he motioned for her to roll down her window. She reached over and pressed the button, but nothing happened.
It won't roll down. I think my battery is dead. My car just died right there in the middle of the interstate, she said.
Strange. Are you all right? You're not injured, are you? Bentley asked. The woman felt her head.
I don't think so, she said.
Rodriguez, why don't you go ahead and call 911 just in case? Bentley told his partner. A moment later, Rodriguez returned, holding up his phone. It's dead. Use mine, Bentley said. I tried. It's dead, too. It can't be. It's been on the charger all morning, Bentley said, walking back to the sedan. He reached in and grabbed his phone from the console. Bentley pressed the button to wake it up, and nothing. He stared at the black screen as the realization seeped into his brain. He cursed under his breath and threw the phone onto the seat. Bentley turned and leaned against the sedan, running both hands through his black hair. What's up? Rodriguez said. We're freaking screwed, that's what's up. You don't think... Rodriguez said. You tell me. What the hell else can simultaneously kill all vehicles and phones over a wide area? Rodriguez leaned back against the vehicle, bent over, placed his hands on his knees, and retched. Exactly. They actually set off an EMP on us, Bentley said. I can't believe they really did it, knowing that we'd respond, Rodriguez said. I can't believe we weren't able to stop them in time. You think they fed us that information about the refineries as a distraction? Rodriguez said. It must have worked, Bentley said. There had been chatter about a plan by the Chinese, Russians, and Iranians to release a nuclear bomb high in the atmosphere over the Midwest, creating an electromagnetic pulse capable of destroying the U.S. power grid, crippling most of the United States. But there had been chatter for years. As far as Bentley knew, there hadn't been any credible proof of them attempting to implement such a plan. Obviously, there was a lot he didn't know. So now what? Rodriguez asked. Bentley turned and looked south. Now we get the hell to high ground. Shit, I almost forgot about the hurricane. Rodriguez scanned the highway. And how are we supposed to evacuate now? Walk, Bentley said flatly. Damn, now I wish I hadn't moved out to the woodlands. That's one hell of a walk, Rodriguez said. He stepped onto the roadway and took a deep breath. What are you going to do? Bentley looked back over his shoulder. There was no way he was attempting to hump it all the way to Clear Lake. They were less than 3 miles from the safe house where he was to meet his informant. Bentley reached into the sedan and retrieved his keys. I'm heading to Midtown.
You're crazy.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?